Cameron, do I really have to sign a buyer-broker agreement before seeing new homes? Is it a new law? And what happens if I'm not ready to commit to one agent? There's been a lot of confusion since the 2024 NAR, National Association of Realtors, settlement, especially here in Utah. So in this video, I'm going to break down what actually changed, what's an NAR rule versus a law, what buyer-broker agreements really mean for buyers, and why some agents are starting with a limited service agreement instead of jumping straight to a full buyer-broker agreement. Okay, so why did the lawsuit change the requirement for a broker agreement? First, let's clear up a big misconception. The requirement for agents to have a written buyer agreement before showing homes is not a law. It's not a Utah law. It's not a federal law. Primarily, it's just a new rule created by NAR because of the settlement that went into effect August 17th, 24. The lawsuit focused on how buyer agent compensation was handled through the MLS, and one of the major outcomes was the buyer compensation can't be advertised, or the buyer broker compensation can't be advertised on the MLS. And realtors working with buyers now need the written agreement before touring any homes. This is the important part. If an agent's a realtor and a member of NAR and uses the MLS, they have to follow these rules. That's very different from saying there's a law that's been passed requiring buyers to sign contracts. That's not the case. Now, Utah was already ahead of most states with buyer-broker agreements. So, Utah has a law stating that a buyer has to sign a buyer-broker agreement before writing an offer on a property. That doesn't mean, but it doesn't clarify when that has to take place. But the NAR settlement says that we have to sign it. We have to have it signed before showing a house to somebody. So really the biggest thing that changed in Utah was just the timing of when we were getting these signs. Most time before this settlement, you could call an agent, they could show you a few houses, you could see if you liked each other or not and wanted to work with them, and then when you wrote an offer on a property, that's when a lot of agents were getting the broker agreements signed. Some agents were signing them earlier in that process. Some agents, right when they made an offer, it just depended on the agent and their clients. Now, the realtor rule requires the agreement up front before even entering a property and has that formalization solidified before seeing any houses. Okay, so what is a buyer-broker agreement? A buyer-broker agreement's simply the contract between the buyer and their buyer agent and their brokerage that explains who represents you, what services are provided, how the agent gets paid, the length of the agreement, and whether the agreement is exclusive or limited or non-exclusive. And one thing buyers should always know, people buying or selling houses should always know, is agent commissions have always been and are still currently negotiable. Each agent sets their own fee and what they'll give their services for. That's not set in stone by any organization, other than maybe the brokerage they work at might have a requirement of what they charge, but that's in each individual case by case. They're always negotiable. Not everybody has the same fees. That's something you want to talk to your agent about. But that doesn't mean, signing these agreements doesn't mean that you're automatically on the hook to write a big paycheck, right? I get paid when the transaction closes. Most agents, they get paid when the transaction closes. So if you don't buy a property, realtors are cheap, honestly, when you think about it, because a lot of times agents don't ever make a paycheck from somebody. They can show them 50 houses, and if they don't ever help those people buy a house, they may not get paid. That's all clarified in those agreements, and it makes the process more clear for everybody. And in most cases nowadays, as an agent, I can negotiate that fee from the sellers. That's not always the case, but in the market right now, typically we can negotiate. Okay, so I mentioned a couple of different agreements. What's an exclusive agreement versus a limited services agreement versus a non-exclusive? A lot of people hear buyer-broker agreement and they think they're immediately locked into a 6-month exclusive relationship with one agent. That isn't necessarily true. So what a limited services agreement is exactly that. It just lays down that your contractual agreement is for a very limited time, or even the amount of properties you see. And how that's written just depends on what you want. Whether it's like, I want you to show me these 3 houses today. We're going to do the agreement for those 3 houses. And then if we decide to make a move on one of those 3 houses, we'll do a more formalized agreement later. Or it could be, I'm going to be in town for a week. I want to see a bunch of properties while I'm in town, and we're going to sign this limited services agreement because I'm from out of town and I don't know if I really want to use you or somebody else. And something like that can be worked out. There is the option to do a non-exclusive buyer agreement with a broker. Most agents don't like to do that because it can be tough to negotiate, and a lot of times we feel we can't give our best service to somebody. It is a possibility. It's just not something that's very commonly done. And sometimes we as agents will like to start with the limited services agreement because we may not know if we want to work with you as a client. So that interview or that interaction goes both ways. And then you have the full buyer broker agreement, which lays out how long we're going to work together, what types of properties you're looking for, how I get paid, what my fees are, and all of the other stuff that goes with that. That is your more traditional buyer broker agreement. So why this can actually help buyers. So a lot of buyers, everybody gets frustrated with paperwork, right? You're going to buy a house. You already know there's going to be a lot of paperwork. A lot of people don't realize there's going to be quite a bit of paperwork right up front. And now with this rule, there is some more paperwork right up front before you go look at houses. And that's one reason I like to sit down and have a conversation with people. So it can be frustrating on both sides, but really it's great for everybody. Because everybody's up front and everybody has clear expectations. What services you're getting, how representation works, what I'm responsible for as an agent, and how compensation's handled. Because before this, a lot of people just didn't have a clue. And so it gives me the opportunity to sit down with buyers before we even go out to look at houses and kind of set expectations and go over the purchasing process and what that looks like, what's expected, what we may go through, what we may see, and those things like that. So now you don't have to use an agent to purchase a house or to sell one, and you don't have to use a buyer agent. You can call the listing agent, and the listing agent can get you into the property they're listing because their duty is to their seller, the person listing the property for sale. So they can show that property to anybody because the way your fiduciary duty works with your client is as a listing agent, you're selling the house. And so it's your duty to show that house to people. So that buyer broker agreement's not required. Also with open houses, when this first came out, there was a lot of agents requiring these agreements to go into an open house. That's not the proper practice. That's not required. You can hold an open house. You can go to any number of open houses and not have to sign any type of contract. Most agents will ask you to sign a guest list or guest sheet or sign-in sheet for the open house. We do that for a whole bunch of different reasons. Safety for the agent, safety and for the property, because we are allowing strangers into somebody's home, and so a lot of sellers want to know who's been coming through, and it's there's a whole bunch of different reasons. Don't feel angry when an agent wants you to sign a sign-in sheet to go into open house. That's not the buyer contract. But the problem with contacting the seller agent directly is, like I said before, their fiduciary duty is solely for their client, the person that is selling the property. And so if you go unrepresented, they aren't going to have your best interests at heart. That's why a lot of people choose to use a buyer agent, because the agent works for the buyer and has to take their best interest into consideration, and is working for that buyer and can negotiate for that buyer on behest of that buyer. And we work for you in your best interest to have your goals met, where the listing agent is their fiduciary duties with that seller, and so they're trying to get the most money out of the house, best terms for the seller, and so it isn't always a great idea, especially if you're not super savvy with negotiation or contracts or the whole purchase process. You may want to seriously consider having a buyer agent. And so anything like you talk to that listing agent about, they can use, just like the cops, they can use that against you in negotiations. And so, and there are cases where we can do what's called a limited agency, where as a realtor, we take a step back and we sign the buyer. We have the buyer as a client and the seller as a client, and we work together, and we turn into more of a neutral third party versus working to, for our client's best interest. We still have our client's best interests in mind, but we take a more limited scope and more just become a facilitator in the transaction more than an agent with our client's best interests in mind. So sometimes if I'm selling a property, I have a buyer come in, they want to make an offer. If my client's not comfortable with me doing both sides of the deal, then I will refer that buyer to another agent so they can be fully represented. I have no problem doing that. So I hope this clears up some confusions about buyer broker agreements. The biggest takeaways are it's an NAR and MLS rule change. It is not a law. So it's on me to get that signed. I'm the one who can get in trouble if I don't do that. So it's a requirement. It's a professional requirement on my part to have that assigned before I show somebody a house. So that's why we're asking, right? As agents, if you've talked to an agent and they want you to sign an agreement before seeing a house, that's why. We're not trying to just lock somebody in and take advantage of people. That's not the idea. The idea is transparency. You still have a choice with agents as a buyer. You can set and choose the terms of the broker contract, broker agreement. We can, like I said, start with limited services before going to exclusive. We take that by case basis. So if you're in Northern Utah, if you have any questions about how a buyer broker agreement works, feel free to reach out. And if this video helped clarify things for you, like and subscribe, comment, ask some questions. We'll see you next time.